Well, good morning. Today we're on chapter 20. And if there's any two words that I want you to remember this morning, they're the words root and stem. Okay, let me show you what I mean. We have the word akuo, and when we go into the future, we have akuso. Okay, absolutely regular, no problems there at all. You have the basic word, aku. You add the sigma, the tense formative, and the personal ending, and you get akuso. Okay, no big deal. But the important thing is that you have the same stem in both the present and the future. These are the kind of words we looked at in chapter 19. So you have akuo and akuso. Okay, what about a word like balo with double lambdas? In the future, you have balo. Now, just for a moment, ignore the fact that there's no sigma. That's another issue we'll look at in a little bit. But what's the other change that happened? Yeah, right. You've gone from a double lambda to a single lambda. Okay, now this is an example of what chapter 20 is all about. There's lots of changes like this in the Greek verbal system. From a double consonant to a single consonant, different kinds of changes to the basic form of the verb as we move through the different tenses. And the question is, do you want to just memorize all these different forms, or would you rather learn a couple of rules, learn a couple of patterns, and be able to identify them? Well, obviously by now you know that my approach is the latter. The fact of the matter is that the most basic form of a verb is not its present tense stem. The most basic form of a verb is its root. Now that distinction is critical. For example, in akuo, you see the form to the left with the asterisk. I always put an asterisk before a root. The root of akuo is aku. And the root comes into the present tense and into the future tense without any change. But look at balo. The root of balo, its most basic form, is bal with a single lambda. For some reason, when Greeks formed the present tense stem from the root, they doubled the lambda. And if you think that the present tense stem is the most basic, then when you get to these other forms, like in the future, you're going to have to memorize it as an irregularity. Well, that's not what we're going to do here. What we're going to do is look at the root. The most basic form of the verb has a single lambda. And when they used the root to form the present tense stem, it was doubled. But guess what? When you form the other tense stems with bal, it doesn't double. It's really easy to think that the present tense stem is the most basic because that's the first one we learned, but that's not the case. I'm going slowly here at first because I really want the basic message of roots and stems to come through. The root is the most basic form of a word. And in fact, the root can come up in nouns and in adjectives as well as verbs. The stem is what that root looks like in a particular tense. So you have the root bal with a single lambda. When you go into the present, it's doubled, balo. But when you go into the future, it's balo, a single lambda. And when you go into one of the past tenses, which we haven't learned yet, but it's ebalon, again, with a single lambda. So all that to say, the root is the most basic form of the word, and then it's from the root that the different tense stems are formed. And what we're going to learn is that in the formation of the present tense stem, we'll see the most change. In other words, in the other tenses, the root isn't changed as much as it is in the present tense stem. At a practical level, what that means is that when we memorize a verb, we will also always memorize its root. Balo means I throw. It occurs 122 times in the New Testament. It's from the root bal, and then in the future, it's balo. There are three basic patterns in terms of how the root moves into the present tense stem. And we're going to categorize verbs based on this fact. Sometimes the root isn't modified at all. In other words, like akuo, you look at the present tense stem and you're going to see the root, aku. But there's another group of verbs that modify the root regularly in the formation of the present tense stem. And again, these don't have to be memorized because you're going to learn the patterns and you'll be able to identify the inflected forms when you see them. But there is a third category where a verb actually uses different roots altogether in the formation of the different tense stems. And there's not many of those, but they occur a whole lot. So those will have to be memorized. Okay, those are your three basic patterns. Okay, let's break those three patterns down. The first pattern is the pattern where the verbal root comes into the present tense stem without change. And these are actually the verbs that we learned in chapter 19. And so, for example, we have roots that end in an iota or an upsilon, like akuo, where the root appears the same in both the present and the future. We saw contracts, where the root appears in the present and in the future, the only difference being the contract vowel is lengthened before the tense formative in the future. But there's been no change in the root at all, is there? And then there's words that end in a stop, words like blepo. And when the final consonant meets up with the sigma of the tense formative, regular things happen. Those are all three different categories in pattern 1, and we met them in chapter 19. Now there is one more category called liquids, but we'll learn that at the end of this chapter. Okay, what about pattern 2, verbal roots that are modified regularly in the formation of the present tense? Well, there's three subcategories for this. There are some stems that end in a stop. Now, these are different than what we saw in pattern 1, because there's other things going on as well. But they're words that end in a stop. Take, for example, and again, you don't have to memorize these right now. I just want you to see how the pattern works. Take a root like baptid, ends in a dental. These roots that end in a dental, in the formation of the present tense stem, are changed to zetas. And so you have baptidzo. But once you get out of the present tense system, for example, into the future is not being formed off the present tense stem, it's being formed off the root. So you have the root baptid, then you have the sigma tense formative. What happens to a dental before a sigma? All right, it drops out. And so the future is baptizo. Now, some people may look at baptizo and go, oh, it's irregular, there's no zeta, I have to memorize this. No, you don't. What you do is you memorize that the root of baptizo is baptid, ending in a delta, and from that point on, it's perfectly regular. And guess what? When you get into the other tenses, they are going to be formed off of the root that ends in a dental, and they're all regular as well. What if the stem ends in a velar, like tarach, with a chi? Well, what happened with this word? Again, in the formation of the present tense stem, the root was altered and you ended up with a double sigma. But when you go to the other tenses, you're interacting with the root, not the present tense stem, and everything is regular. And so the future of tarasso is taraxo. So again, let me remind us what we're doing here. This kind of thing happens all over the place in the Greek verbal system. You can either memorize all these tense forms, or you can learn a couple of rules. The rule here is that stems in idzo or adzo are really stems in a dental. If you know that, then you've saved yourself hundreds of forms that you don't have to memorize. And when you see baptizo, it's absolutely regular. No big deal. See what's going on? Okay, what about the next category in pattern 2, called double consonants? These are words that in the present tense stem end in a double consonant. And again, balo is the best example. In these kinds of words, what's actually going on is that the root has a single consonant. That single consonant was doubled in the formation of the present tense stem, but it's not doubled in the other tenses. And so, for example, in the future, you have balo with a single lambda. Again, I'll talk in a bit about why there's no sigma, but that's something else. So balo kind of words are another example of pattern 2. Now the third category in pattern 2 are words that have added a letter to the root in the formation of the present tense stem, and obviously when you get into the other tense stems, that added letter will not be present, but rather those other tense stems, like the future, will be formed from the root. So we have a word I-rho, alpha, iota, rho, omega. The future is a rho. You go, oh, it lost the iota. No, the root of I-rho is R, alpha, rho. The iota was added to form the present tense stem, but the other tense stems are formed from the root alpha, rho, and don't have the iota. See how this is working? Another collection of letters that can be added is isk. So, for example, you have the root apothon, and then you add isk, and a few other things happen, in order to form the present tense stem, and you get apothanesko. So the alpha of the stem dropped out and the iota under the eta, other things happening. But look what happens in the future. Apothanumai, it's a future deponent. Now, if you memorize that apothanesko is the most basic form of the word, you get to apothanumai, you go, oh man, I just got to memorize this. No, all that you have to memorize is that the root of apothanesko is apothan, and when you get into the future, the only thing you have to remember is that it's a middle deponent. Okay, now, I can see the look in your eyes. Don't glaze over on me yet, all right? Don't kind of fade away. This is quite a bit of theory. I understand that. But in a sense, it's not really that much theory. The theory is that the root is the basic form of the word. The root may or may not be modified in the formation of the present tense stem. But there are certain patterns, and if we can get used to the patterns, then we're going to be able to parse these words easily without memorizing hundreds of tense forms. The third pattern and the last pattern are those verbs that actually have totally different roots. For example, there's the word horao. It means I see. It's from the root hora. No big deal. When you get to the future, it's a middle deponent and it's opsomai. And you go, how did you go from horao to opsomai? Well, you didn't in a sense. There's a totally different root behind the future, and the root is op. In other words, in a sense, it's like horao lost its future form, and apo, I'm not sure what it would have been in the present, but anyway, that root lost its present form. They kind of, okay, this is a simplification, but they kind of got together, and so you have this verb that says, well, hey, I'm going to use hora for the present, but I'll use op in the future. Like I said, there's very few of these words, but they're very frequent, and you just have to memorize them. Okay, those are the three patterns of how a root moves into the different tenses. And in section 12 in the book, I list all the verbs that you've learned so far, and I list them in the root and in the present tense stem and in the future. I would really encourage you to spend time with that chart and just walk through and get accustomed to the patterns. Learn to see the patterns. Because once you learn the patterns, you won't have anything else to learn when you find other words that follow the same pattern. Again, that's the whole idea, okay? All right. One more thing we need to learn about the futures, and then we're done with the futures. And it's something called a liquid future. If in the future the stem ends in a lambda, mu, nu, or rho, those are considered the four liquids. They're going to form their future tense a little differently. And the difference is it doesn't use the sigma as a tense formative. It uses epsilon sigma as a tense formative. But then you have epsilon, sigma, and the connecting vowel. You have what's called an intervocalic sigma. And sigmas between vowels don't hang around in Greek, they drop out. You've got two vowels up against each other, and they contract. So these are those verbs that in the future don't have a sigma. For example, one of the liquids is meno. You take the root men, you add epsilon sigma, connecting vowel, primary active personal endings. The sigma drops out. The epsilon omicron contract to oo, and you have menumen. Menumen is the first person plural future active indicative of meno. Okay, there's not really that much here. It's just a little bit of memory work and knowing the different tense formative. But here's the chart. So, for example, here's the present of meno. Meno, menes, mene, menemen, menete, menusi. Here's what it looks like in the future with the contractions. Meno, menes, mene, menumen, menete, menusi. Now, in case the future of meno looks kind of familiar, compare it to a present contract, like poieo. What do you have? Well, you have the same endings, don't you? It looks the same. Poio, poies, poie, poiumen, poieta, poiusi. Okay, so you have the present of liquids, the future of liquids, and then you have the present of epsilon contracts kind of hanging around too, trying to confuse you. Okay, how are you going to remember that meno is a future of a liquid? Well, there's a couple of things. One is just your straight memory work. You know that meno can't be a present active epsilon contract because you haven't memorized the verb meneo. You've memorized it meno. In other words, there is no epsilon contract that in the present can go to meno. Okay, so memory work helps. Secondly, you look and you see a liquid before the omega. That helps you understand also that this is a future liquid. And although you can't see it with meno, sometimes when you have liquid futures, there's been a stem change as well. Again, just go back to balo. Balo is a liquid. The root is bal. And so in the future, it's balo. Now, you're not going to confuse balo with a double lambda and balo with a single lambda, are you? I mean, the change in the stem, so to speak, will alert you to the fact that balo can't be a present. Something I learned quite a while ago has come back to help me quite a bit. And that is, I remember someone telling me, concentrate on the consonants, kind of like we're in Hebrew. Vowels can change much more than consonants can change. And if you're struggling a bit, make sure that in your memory work, you're really concentrating on the consonants. That balo has a beta and two lambdas. See, if you can get that into your mind, then when you see a beta and a single lambda, you know you're not in the present tense system. So concentrate on those consonants. Okay, finally, one more line here in the master verb chart. How do you form a liquid future active? You start with a future active tense stem. You add a tense formative epsilon sigma, and you understand the contractions that are going to occur when you connect it to the connecting vowel. And then you use primary active endings. And so, for example, you get meno. I'm going to say this one last time. We did quite a bit of theory this morning, but the theory is here so that you won't go off and memorize hundreds of forms. See, the real challenge when you get out of first-year Greek class is to keep using all that you've learned. And the greatest impediment that I have seen for people using Greek, and we all know of pastors who, because of the demands of the pastorate, have not been able to review the Greek and hence have forgotten it and can't use it. See, the real problem is memory work. Now, some of you may have these incredible minds that never forget anything. You're the lucky ones. For most of us, if we're going to memorize a lot of things, then we have to review them over and over and over again. But life in general fights against that kind of review. I mean, I even know Greek teachers that before they start the semester have to go back and rememorize all the paradigms because they just don't stick in their minds. Again, there are some exceptions, but that's the majority of people. So what I want to do is to reduce the amount of memory work. The most effective way to do that is to help you see the rules and the patterns. And that way, when you get out of school and you get into real life, especially the pastorate, where it's just the pace is hectic, then you won't have to keep reviewing, but you will still be able to identify meno as the future. All right?